Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another season recap here on the Sports Daily Media Network YouTube channel. I'm your host, Sean Vowells, and joined with me is Joe Meade. And today, we're going over the Penn State Nittany Lions season. Joe, they were 13-3 on the year, 8-1 in the conference. That was good enough for tied for second. They made it all the way to the college football playoff semifinal, where their season ended to Notre Dame. But Joe, um, a lot of things that we can get into here for Penn State, but what were your overarching thoughts on the Nittany Lions season?
I thought going into the year they had a really good chance to make the 12-team playoff, and ultimately, as you explained, they did. But I was really more worried about, can Penn State get over these, let's call them metaphorical hurdles? Can they beat an Ohio State? They didn't have Michigan on their schedule, but can they beat a like-minded opponent like Michigan? Take like similarly like an Oregon or a USC, which is who we thought going into the year had a chance to be pretty good. So I think there's so many different ways to grade this season, Sean, and we're gonna wait for that till the end. But I do think this is probably one of the more condensed grading packets we could give to a team that ultimately ended in the Final Four. But I think there's so many different ways you could do it. So interested as we dive into this to see what our thoughts bring together.
And they started off the year with a road victory in a rivalry game over West Virginia. And the Mountaineers didn't have a great season, but we didn't know it at the time. And it was a pretty impressive victory to start off the year. They backed that up with a really nervous 7-point win against Bowling Green, in which the visitors led at halftime. And then they backed that up with a big 56-0 win over Kent State. But Joe, after you get your power conference non-conference W, you barely slip by Bowling Green, and then you take care of Kent State. And to the end of the day, Penn State did start 3-0.
Yeah, Sean, I thought overall there was nothing really concerning. I understand the Bowling Green game might get picked apart, especially in the heat of the moment it was. You have to remember the 2023 Michigan football team that won the national title struggled with Bowling Green as well. Now, that's not to say that Bowling Green should be the ultimate mulligan and that playing bad against them is acceptable. But I thought overall their body of work was really good enough to their body of work in those three games was nothing alarming. And overall, there were other teams in the conference, cough, cough, Michigan, that were a lot more concerning at the time that the media eviscerated. So whether that was given attention or not is really, I think, kind of the point of this, because I don't think people could have picked them apart the way that.
Oop, looks like we might have lost Joe there. Oh, I'm hoping not. Well, they're not conference slate. They did go 3-0. Hopefully we'll get.
Conference. Maybe if
Yep,
this
he's
was,
back. All right, you're back, Joe. You're back.
yeah, like maybe if this was a 14-team conference, they perhaps could have been picked apart a lot more. But overall, Sean, the three games, no one really changed their expectations or their view of Penn State. Let's be real honest here.
They did start the Big Ten season 4-0, a nice defensive effort and a home win over Illinois 21-7. They took care of business against UCLA 27-11. Then they go on the road and get to, not amazing victories, but pretty solid victories on the road in LA against USC, and then at Camp Randall against Wisconsin. But Joe, I think this is the moment where we realized that the 12-team playoff was a distinct possibility, whether they got over the hump in those games or not.
Yeah, Sean, I was most impressed probably at this point up to the year. I understand the Illinois game. In hindsight, you beat a 10-win team that finished within the top 20. I was overall most impressed with their win at USC. This was a game, Sean. They trailed 14-0 and they trailed at several points in the second half, and they were able to come back each time. And their defense in this game made the big stops. And this is when USC was still kind of at full strength. Miller Moss was playing relatively well before his fall off. Zachariah Branch was providing problems. Hudson, Woody Marks had a great game in this. And in spite of all of that, Penn State won. And there are so many different examples in the earlier Franklin era when they lost games like this, particularly games they've lost at Kinnick, games they've lost, even on the road to like a Michigan State where the home team played well enough and Penn State kind of just collapsed in certain moments. In this game, each quarter of that game, including overtime, you could name a distinct play where they stepped up, whether it was a Tyler Warren, Drew Aller, or the defense wreaking havoc. So that's what I realized. This is a different Penn State team than teams in the past. Now, people were going to point out, oh, they still went 11-2, yada yada, two losses before the playoff or bowl season, but those 11 wins did include wins that, let's face it, Sean, the ESPN FPI, they were favored to lose most of the time against USC, and even at points in Madison on Halloween weekend.
And then up next, they're 7-0, Joe. They're hosting Ohio State. Can they get over the hump despite keeping it within a touchdown? The answer was a resounding no. The Buckeyes did take care of business in Happy Valley. I think the Nittany Lions were fairly lucky to only lose by a touchdown. Ohio State had a couple of, poor mistakes in the red zone. But then they had to take a step back after this one that maybe they weren't the best team in the league, but still, even after that Ohio State loss, they were still in good shape to make the playoff, rattling off four impressive wins in a row. The only one that was really kind of lucky was that win at Minnesota. But, Joe, as they did bounce back from that tough loss against Ohio State with 4 wins, and that's how they ended the regular season.
Yeah, Sean, talking about that Ohio State game, because we've analyzed that in depth when talking about both teams, not only in the past, but probably in the future when we do Ohio State's season recap. I really believe that Penn State was closer in that game than they had been since probably 2018. 2019, they lose by 2 scores, and Ohio State dominated for most of that game. 2020, COVID, Ohio State dominated. 21-22. Penn State was probably 4 or 5 plays away. This game, even though Ohio State made a lot of mistakes, there are 2 distinct plays where Penn State could have executed better, whether it was the interception before halftime that Davison Igbinosun made the pick on, or it was the, 4th and goal line stand, which Ohio State, by the way, I mean, even in their playoff run, did masterfully all year. And even in the game they lost against the games they lost against Michigan and Oregon. So, when I view it that way, I'm less harsh in that judgment, especially because of the way they responded. And another game that, before we get to the Big Ten title game, that reminded me of the USC game, Sean, was their game at Minnesota. There's a real possibility, Sean, that this game might not have mattered had they gone 10-2, and they wouldn't have gone to Indy, but 10-2 probably would have got them in based on the field. But this Minnesota game, they were trailing most of the second half. It took a lot of big plays from Drew Aller, Tyler Warren again saving the day. That's a common theme of this video. And we're going to have to talk about it. James Franklin, his big balls moment was that 4th down, up 1 point, going for the 4th down fake punt, a masterfully executed fake punt. And I know the James Franklin detractors will say, well, if that didn't work, everyone would go at him. He's going to get lucky at 1 point. Well, regardless of luck, voodoo, or any of that, we judge him on the real results. And the real results were that they got the 1st down and iced the game.
Then before the last game, Joe, they had themselves an opportunity. The Wolverines had already beaten Ohio State. So all they had to do against Maryland was win. And they were in the Big Ten championship. They went up really early, and it was over just like that. So you got to credit them for taking care of business there. And not sure they really backed their way into the Big Ten title game, but nobody expected them to be there. And they made it a game in Indy. They went shot for the most part against what looked like probably the best Oregon offensive performance of the season. And Oregon wins by 8 points, 45-37. And this game showed that Penn State's offense could go blow for blow with some of the best. Now, the defense didn't really show up when it had to, like it did in the other games earlier this year. But I think Penn State and their fans were leaving Indy somewhat optimistic despite the loss.
I think most of them did. Now, you will have the common Penn State fans that are sick and tired of being sick and tired, regarding games like that against elite competition. But overall, it was one of those kind of like the Ohio State game where they were a play away. The Aller interception late, or it was the pretty pathetic start on defense where Oregon, it seemed like every play they were getting a 1st down. They adjusted well, and at the time, that was the number 1 team in the country. I thought, in terms of a loss, that's as good a loss as you could have prior to the playoff in a game that ultimately didn't cost them much of anything except a trophy.
And it may have helped them, Joe, the way that the college football playoff ended up. Big Ten champions Oregon obviously don't win a game, and we think this format will be fixed in the future. But, Joe, Penn State comes in as the number 6 seed, and they get a fairly soft draw, if you want to say it. They host SMU, they take care of business there, and then they do the same thing against Boise State in the Fiesta Bowl. Now, many people will point to them probably playing two of the three worst teams in the playoff, but they thoroughly dismantled both of them to get to the semifinals.
Yeah, Sean, in a way, they treated SMU and Boise State like they treated inferior Big Ten West opponents when they came to Happy Valley in whiteout-esque environments. Now, the first playoff game, I'm not going to give much credit to the offense at all. I'm going to give all the credit to the defense. The 2 pick-sixes, the 3 first-half interceptions. Drew Aller just had to exist, and they even overcame a play most people aren't going to remember, the James Franklin going for it at their own 20. It didn't cost them anything because they got a pick like 3 plays later. So that was a game that's going to be very forgettable for a lot of people, but I do think it showed, in spite of the results against the elite teams, the Oregons and the Ohio States, that Penn State, in comparison to the rest of the nationally good teams like SMU, they were ways and ways ahead of them.
Yeah, they proved that they're. We said it a couple times this year. There's levels to this, and Penn State might not be the top level of the Big Ten, but they're certainly above. Really, all of the OA teams were thoroughly beaten if you think about it in that first round. And whether it was Tennessee, Indiana, SMU, all of them were beaten pretty good. And Penn State then parlays that with a nice victory against Ashton Chanty and the Boise State Broncos. And then, Joe, in the college football playoff semifinal, they went blow for blow with Notre Dame, and it just ended up coming down to a field goal, which they were on the wrong end of. But they really competed in this one, and this is obviously the game that ended their season, which they'll want back. But they probably deserved to lose the other 2 games that they lost, and this one was truly a coin toss, and it just happened to not go their way.
Yeah, Sean. One last thing on the Boise game before I do transition to the negatives here. They held probably the guy who should have won the Heisman in a lot of people's minds to, about 100 yards or less. So
like 3.2 yards per carry, though.
Yeah, effectively. And what they have coming back in K-Tron Allen and Nick Singleton, this is the K-Tron Allen show. And I know Tyler Warren, every game was the Tyler Warren show effectively. But K-Tron Allen in this game, if he left at Penn State after this year, this would have been his legacy game. So it really showed how much the offense had grown throughout the season, particularly at the Ohio State. I think Andy Koldalnicki, who they do get back, had to repivot a lot of things and rethink a lot of concepts. And at the end of the day, Penn State's offense runs really well when they run the ball well. And this game was the prime example of that. And going into the Notre Dame game, we both knew they were going to struggle with that. The first half, they were pretty well balanced overall. You thought, hey, 10-3 lead at halftime, and they could continue to run this thing with a 7-point lead, even though that seems slim. They can really do this. Unfortunately for them, that second half, allowing Notre Dame to tie it and then having to go blow for blow. I do think if I could go back, if I were a Penn State fan and could go back, the biggest thing I would want to change is the first half, perhaps getting to a bigger lead than 10-3. I think they could have had a 17 or a 14-3 lead at points where they moved the ball well. And I thought the receivers in that game, even though you're going to point out, oh, they didn't get a reception and whatnot, it was just the Tyler Warren and the running back show. One thing I'll say is they gave Notre Dame's secondary a lot of problems. I do think, it came down to the one bad decision by Drew Aller, unfortunately, at the end. That's going to get highlighted. And although I don't think that was everything in the game that could have went wrong for them, it was just at the exact wrong moment. So for some Penn State fans, it was more of the same. And I do relate to I can't relate to the Jaeger. I think to have pride in the season is really important because that's their first, Final Four in college football in the playoff era. So not to treat that like it's nothing, but I do think you're asking one of the 3 questions you had about Penn State. Can they win the big one? And a lot of people are going to answer no, unfortunately.
All right, Joe, it's time to grade the season. We take everything into account when we make these grades: expectations, results, the matter of them, consistency, all that. So, Joe, where are you putting Penn State on our report card?
Yeah, one last part of the rubric, Sean. I know we're going to try to keep these more concise. Um, Based on what they have coming back, you do lose Tom Allen, but then you gain your arch nemesis is defensive coordinator in Jim Knowles, who signing for about $3 million a year, who's going to be probably the highest paid coordinator in the 2025 season. So you bring him in and then you lose some of the receivers, which again, I think they are replaceable. The biggest loss is going to be Tyler Ward, Abdul Carter. I think that's going to be a main problem. But in terms of what you could bring back in Katron Allen, the three-headed monster, Allen, Singleton, and Drew Aller, I think we're going to be grading Penn State really harshly next year, which is a good thing because they're going to have high expectations. With all that said, taking into account everything, future of the program, the season they had, I'm going to give them an A minus, with the only real detraction being that they couldn't answer one of my three questions. Can they beat the elite of the elite? Unfortunately, they came really close, I think, in three games, and one still hasn't fallen their way. You would think eventually that's going to happen, and we're going to have to wait till fall to find out. But A minus for me, Sean.
Yep, I'm going with an A. We talked about that coming into the year. Penn State could probably just do their thing and still make the 12-team college football playoff, and for the most part, they did. They didn't really expect to be there in the Big Ten championship, and I thought they provided decent account for themselves, and then they ended up making the Final Four and were really close to the championship game. So it's hard to give them worse than an A for me when they were picked third or fourth in this Big Ten to start the year, and I think they got the job done there. Change in coordinator, you've got a couple of your big offensive players returning, so again, going into next year, Joe, I think the expectation should be that this team should get back to the 12-team college football playoff.
I think at a minimum, and perhaps even lift their first Big Ten title in what'll be 9 years, and their first national title in about what'll be 40 years, Sean.
So we get the rosters aren't really finalized yet. There could be some movement in the spring transfer portal, but we will come back with a season preview in late summer with the schedules and when we'll get a better look at what this season will look like for Penn State. So that is all we have for you today. Thank you for tuning into this season recap. This is our third one. Please check out the other two if you haven't already, and please check out the ones in the future. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.